There's argument made that slaves using poison to harm or kill their masters was more prevalent in antebellum Virginia than is currently acknowledged by historians. And acknowledging this is important to gain a full understanding of the extent of slave resistance. Jane held onto a secret until her grave. Back in 1850, Joseph and Virginia lost another infant daughter named Lavinia Cary. Her death was little noted as infant mortality was a sadly familiar occurrence for the age. After her hanging, Jane's white pastor, Reverend Robert Ryland, revealed that Jane had poisoned the child by administering just a teaspoon of bedbug poison. But she wanted this kept silent until after she was dead so as to be hanged officially and not by a lynch mob. I implore you to listen to this entire video, and I will most likely have to upload part 2 as it is a long paper or work or research. You won't regret it and you won't be disappointed. I'll be back. Welcome back, subscribers, and those who are not subscribed and maybe new to this channel. Thank you very much. Let's get into this. I used to say in some videos, I don't remember which ones, but there are things that, slavery is discussed in so many ways, whether for history purposes or reparations or anti-reparations is discussed, but there are a lot of things that aren't discussed, and those are the things that involve revolts, slave revolts, and slave resistance and slave rebellion. A lot of people don't want to discuss that for obvious reasons. They wanted to paint the picture that slaves were docile and they actually liked slavery. Yeah, I don't know too many people that like being unfree. So, them wanting people to believe that slaves were docile and they like that wicked institution is just another psychological game that this country plays very well. So let's get into this. Like I said, while living in Richmond, Virginia in the early 1850s, one slave, a certain Jane Williams, realized that there was more than one way to skin a cat. Or in this case, more than one way to subvert or utterly destroy the people supporting or degrading an exploitative institution. In her bid for liberation, Jane decided to massacre with an axe the wife and infant daughter of her employer. This quite understandably aroused horror and indignation in both the community and media, but it was Jane's earlier crime that should have horrified them all. Almost 2 years prior to her rampage, Jane had, unnoticed, fatally poisoned her master's baby. Although Jane's convert infanticide seems like and very well could have been a wanton act of violence, careful consideration reveals the larger significance of her actions. While the existing written records from Virginia's antebellum period are heavily biased towards giving a perspective of wealthy white people, the essential facet of blacks' feeling towards slavery can be seen in how they behave within and against the institution. Herein lies the significance of Jane's crimes: slave resistance. While slaves may not have written much, their actions serve as a text to reveal their feelings towards their condition. Although previous scholarship has examined openly violent slave resistance such as rebellion and covert actions such as arson, the use of poison by slaves against masters has largely gone ignored. In order to fully comprehend the intensity and scope of slave resistance in antebellum Virginia, one must look beyond conventional crime records and physically harmless behaviors to consider the possibility of many undetected assassinations of slave owners via poison. Antebellum Virginia is a prime case study for slave poisoning, as the state had its own peculiar ideology. Following the Revolution, Virginians in particular had a hard time reconciling their ideas of liberty and their desire to own people. This moral contradiction could only be resolved with self-deception on the grandest scales. According to Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Ann Taylor, Virginians formed a paternalistic system in an attempt to convince themselves that slavery was a mutually beneficial institution. Then a certain person running for president say that bullcrap, like slavery benefited slaves as well. I'm still waiting for the proof to show how it benefited slaves. Let's go on. This self-deception was a poisoner's dream, as slave owners lacked the caution necessary to be suspicious of their suddenly content slaves. Further, although Virginia was overwhelmingly rural and a plantation based, it was probably unique in the South in the extent of its manufacturing and the use of slaves in industry. Over time, Virginia switched to growing grains such as wheat instead of tobacco, because grains were less labor intensive. Virginia slaveholders found themselves with a surplus of human property. With this shift in the economy, there also came a shift in slave owning habits. Slaves who were not sold south could find themselves rented out. This is what is referred to as the hiring out system. This created a new ambiguous group of slave owners, as they only had slaves on a temporary contractual basis. This led to a sometimes permissive form of slavery that emboldened slaves to take control of their own lives. If a slave moved to the city and lived apart from whites, he might not have had his freedom, but he lost a considerable part of his bondage. Slaves working in Richmond could even earn wages, which, beyond the very literal objects they could now afford, also brought them some human dignity, pride, independence, manhood, and self-esteem. It is under this weak form of semi-freedom that resentment and plots to poison could flourish. The scholarship on slave resistance has always been something of a battleground. Despite the broadness of this definition, resistance and violence in daily affairs usually represented the settling of personal or local scores rather than a collective attempt to overthrow an overwhelming white power. Large-scale resistance, those attempts through rebellion and insurrection that rattled the entirety of the slaveholding system, has gotten a lion's share of scholars' attention. Often when people think of slave revolts, they think of organized, violent, very public actions such as the even popular, ever controversial Nat Turner's Rebellion. According to Leslie Howard Owens, in the past, historians had a limited view of resistance, believing that if the slave was not a Nat Turner, then he was submissive, a typical slave type Sambo. For scholars and the public alike, Nat Turner's uprising represents a shining moment in the otherwise dark history of American slavery. It was an example of slaves challenging an oppressive and brutalizing regimen in North America. Blacks have come to regard this slave uprising as a moment of resistance, empowerment, and justice in historical memory. Due to this desire to hear stories of heroics, scholars like Eric R. Taylor has written expansive books on slave revolts, including those that occurred at sea. Just like Turner's Rebellion, ship revolts tended to be bloody and courageous, such as the famous Amistad case and the daring and successful Creole case, both of which had male leads. Everybody loves a good story, so the appeal of these dramatic revolts is clear. While these large revolts certainly caught public attention and shook the feeling of scrutiny slave owners possessed, such occurrences were relatively rare and should not be held as representative of resistance. Also, from a strategic standpoint, when slaves openly and violently attacked their enemies, they ran the risk of being caught and severely punished or executed. So even if slaves did wish their masters harm, they did not necessarily openly act on it. Just because the majority of slaves did not go on massacres does not mean they accepted their condition, though. The scholarly focus on violent revolt has led to the erasure of smaller forms of resistance and has particularly been neglectful of representing women in the narrative of resistance. To the dismay of historians like Veda Smith Tucker, when resistance is studied, the focus is usually on methods used by men, which include displays of violence, physical prowess, or intellectual divisiveness, while the crafty tactics that black women use to resist slavery have been understudied and generally mischaracterized as either impulsive or mystical. Of all the women who fought against their bondage, scholarly favorite can be found in Margaret Garner. Garner was a slave who unsuccessfully ran away and, instead of being recaptured, killed one of her children and then attempted to unalive the rest. Garner's plight transcended history and academia and became culturally significant as the inspiration for Toni Morrison's Beloved. Despite the popularity of Garner's story, the way her plight is recounted tends to fall into the previous mentioned trap of female resistance being presented as impulsive, which muffles the fact that slave women could be just as calculating and rational as their male counterparts. What is so ignorant of some men is to think so little of women. And what they fail to realize is that women can be very conniving and calculating. And just because a woman smiles and maybe plays demure, like everything is all right, you don't know what's in her mind. And that's why you might not wake up ever again, because you think so little of women. And that's how a lot of women get away with things. Let's continue. To try to expand the understanding of slave resistance, historians such as Stephanie Kemp brought forth forms of everyday resistance whereby slaves showed their discontent through small actions such as breaking tools or temporarily hiding away. Although this was a much needed addition to the scholarship, as it brought more women into the picture and showed that not all resistance needed to be large in scale or violent, the research of slave resistance still has a wide gap. Violent slave revolts and everyday resistance represented the two extremes of slave resistance. On one hand, violent open revolt; on the other, non-violent resistance that was more of a nuisance than a threat. Surely there has to be a middle ground. Indeed, there is slaves using poison as a form of resistance. Of all murder weapons available to the weak, poison is the most fearsome of all, as it is hard to predict, hard to control, and hard to prove. Slaves were often employed in positions of trust, such as cooks, nannies, and housemaids. Whites realized the vulnerability created by relying on the oppressed for such intimate tasks as revealed in their passing laws to try to keep slaves from acquiring poison, but that did not stop them from employing slaves in their homes anyway. Some slaves certainly took advantage of this trust, as evidenced by long and disturbing court records. The use of poison marks a much needed middle ground on the spectrum of slave resistance, as it is both a violent way to revolt but also hidden. To what extent was poison used as a form of resistance by slaves in antebellum Virginia, and how did the white population respond to the perceived threat? There's argument made that slaves using poison to harm or kill their masters was more prevalent in antebellum Virginia than is currently acknowledged by historians, and acknowledging this is important to gain full understanding of the extent of slave resistance. Plant medicine and poison use was not the exclusive territory of blacks. Although whites often admired black ability to botany, whites had plenty of their plant practices as well. Many slaves used household poisons that were readily available, such as arsenic, casting doubt on the need for generational plant knowledge and the spiritual ties usually associated with it. In reality, slaves were more likely to use household substances than plant poisons with which they were supposed to be familiar. In short, one does not need to be a masterful botanist to place rat poison in someone's coffee. Poison has been used around the globe to kill since time immemorial. In 1531, a cook named Richard Roos poisoned 17 people in the household of the Bishop of Rochester, resulting in 2 deaths. That same year, Henry VIII pushed the House of Lords to upgrade poisoning from murder to treason. Poison murder was deemed so uniquely horrible that the prescribed penalty was to be boiled to death. According to Sir William Blackstone, of all the methods used in murder, poison was the most detestable. It can, of all others, be the least prevented either by manhood or forethought. Once in North America, the anxiety around poison continued. While many slaves utilized poisons that were meant to be ingested, others made traditional African poisons that were to act in many mysterious ways in the forms of charms. Just like poison, charms were not a distinctly African phenomenon. By the mid-18th century, Virginians still believed in charms, curses, and the supernatural, even if they were cautious about bringing them up as a legal issue. In 18th century Virginia, a slave named Dick, living in Mecklenburg, was charged with conspiracy to kill his owner after he beat up leaves with snake heads and left the combination at the door of his master. Although in his head and heart Dick mostly believed this to be an effective way to harm his master, the desired results did not become manifest. Dick's master, John Gregory, was unharmed, but Dick was still convicted of conspiring to poison his master to death. Although Dick's intent was malicious, because his technique did not render the desired result, it was argued that he should be spared his life and be transported. Being pardoned for such a botched crime would have been reasonable if it were not for the threat of violent retaliation on the part of the white neighbors. Dick's case shows how African understanding of poison and white understanding of poison could simultaneously converge and disconnect. As though whites saw his poison as ineffective, they still tried him for poisoning anyway. Although whites had different techniques and perceptions of the natural world, they still believed in the power of natural ingredients. Just as much as anyone else in the pre-industrial world, white Americans of the 18th and 19th centuries looked towards nature to cure what ailed them. Southern herbal medicine was characterized by a high degree of exchange across lines of race, ethnicity, class, and region, leading everyone in the community to try their hand at doctoring with blended techniques. Blacks and whites, despite some basic differences, fully believed in the power of root work to do both good and harm. One major point of divide between white and black root work is while blacks viewed it with mysticism, whites tried to place it in the field of science. Whites were practicing plant medicine, blacks were practicing plant medicine, and there was a blending of the two. Despite that, whites still feared black root work, and for good reasons. Although whites were using herbal medicines, there did seem to be a certain reverence held by whites and blacks alike for slave doctors. While whites had their own long-held practices, enslaved black Americans significantly influenced the herbal repertoire of southern white households. Whites, including Virginia's Lieutenant Governor Sir William Gooch, recognized that black doctors could be talented and contain knowledge they lacked. This led even prominent whites to visit enslaved doctors for recipes and medicine. Black doctors could find success in healing where white doctors failed, and white slave owners trusted their slaves to the care of their healers. This was not always well advised, though. Thomas Jefferson found out in 1799. He lost Jupiter, one of his most valued slaves, to the poisons of the Buckingham Negro conjurer, whose poisons were so powerful that they had the most astonishing effect in producing melancholy and despair. One of the big mysteries of black doctors is how they were able to make such potent poisons. Due to blacks seemingly possessing unnatural knowledge, in some ways it felt that no one was safe. It is alleged that in 1732, with the help of a local conjure man named Pompey, that Ambrose Madison, grandfather to future President James Madison, was poisoned by his own slaves. This case was particularly shocking as it was, if true, the first known instance of slaves successfully murdering a planter. In 1745, in another Orange County case, a female slave, Eve, poisoned her master by putting an unknown substance in his milk. Her master, Peter Montage, languished for an excruciating 4 months. Because this was petite treason as defined by English common law and mentioned earlier, she was burned alive at the stake. In the cases of both Madison and Montage, their deaths were drawn out. The poisons used by slaves at the time tended to have a gradual effect, making them all the more terrifying. Although whites were frightened, what could they do to protect themselves? Let people go? Let's continue. The white perception of black ability in poisoning led to many laws that attempted to weaken the threat of poisoning. In 1748, Virginia passed a law that would have devastating results. And whereas many Negroes, under pretense of practicing physics, have prepared and exhibited poisonous medicines by which many persons have been murdered, and others have languished under long and tedious indispositions, and it will be difficult to detect such precarious and dangerous practices if they should be permitted to exhibit any sort of medicine, be it therefore further enacted by the authority aforesaid, that if any Negro or other slave shall prepare, exhibit, or administer any medicine whatsoever, or she so offending shall be adjudged a felony and suffer death without benefit of clergy. With the passing of this law, the long-held tradition of slave doctors was threatened. Although it was common for states to pass laws regarding slaves and poisoning, Virginia is somewhat unusual in that it eventually made the administration of medicine by blacks, free or enslaved, a capital offense. Following the passage of the 1748 law, there was a marked increase in slaves persecuted for poisoning. An overwhelming majority of slaves, 95 out of 119, tried for poisoning between 1748 and 1784 were accused of administering medicine with ill intent. Not outright using poison, this law did, however, make provisions to receive benefit of clergy if it was adjudged that the poison was not given with ill intent. It could be argued that the number of poison incidents on the trial record of the 18th century were elevated because of this practice of trying people with administered medicine with no ill intent or bad consequences, such as Quash in Cumberland County in 1759. People such as Quash gave a harmless substance with harmless intentions with no harm coming of it can hardly be called poisoners at all. The argument that the number of poison trials held in the 18th century reflect more on white anxiety than actual black threat. This is a real possibility that the perceived threat of poisoning in the 18th century far exceeded the actual threat when it comes to slave rebellion. Anytime a plot or revolt was publicized, there was widespread terror. There's also evidence that this fear existed quite independent of any connection with an actual outbreak. And I would like to add that widespread terror still exists today. It's just covered up. Let's continue. In Alexandria in 1767, slaves poisoned and killed several overseers in what was supposed to be the start of a larger rebellion that was ultimately foiled. This incident caused great paranoia about other potential poison attacks. Local whites were so thoroughly frightened that they cut the executed slaves' heads off and put them on the chimneys of the courthouse to serve as a macabre warning. In this particular case, locals seemed desperate to censor mentions of this event in the local newspaper, perhaps in fear of giving other slaves similar ideas. This brings to mind times that I've said in other videos that I believe there are things that are happening to the front and center group that they keep hidden because they don't want people to know the truth. Yep. Let's continue. Many more slaves were tried in the area over the next 2 years for alleged poisonings. Whether these charges were valid or not can never be known, but whites had abundant reasons to be fearful, so it is understandable if they overestimated the danger they were in. What's so mind-boggling to me is if you had all these poisonings going on that I believe was systematically covered up because they didn't want people to know how often slaves revolted against that sick institution. If you saw the poisonings happening, you saw the slaves resisting slavery, why did you guys keep them in bondage? That demonstrates a mindset that is just not healthy. Let's continue. In the period of 1706 and 1784, 90 slaves were tried for poison offenses against white. Of those 90, 28 were found not guilty and 23 were sentenced to hang. Even of those sentenced to hang, 2 were pardoned by the governor and his council. The other 39 slaves received benefit of clergy, which entitled being branded on the hand, or were convicted for misdemeanors and therefore did not face capital punishment. Keeping in mind that these statistics also include unauthorized distribution of non-harmful medicines, and the numbers do not seem to start. While poisoning was of necessity, usually a hidden action, there is another complication to consider when trying to determine how many masters were unallied by their determined slaves. The fact that poison was essentially everywhere in the 19th century home. Arsenic was in wallpaper, carpeting, and candles, and candy, dance tickets, ball gowns, and even children's paint sets. It was in the air, it was in the water, coating household surfaces. In a word, it was inescapable. Realizing the prevalence and danger of arsenic in everyday living, even the notorious B.T. Burnham had sense enough to warn readers to never buy any confectionery that is colored or painted, as the methods used to achieve the color intended to be poisonous. Arsenic was even used intentionally as a beauty aid. This prevalence of use not only proved hazardous to the health of the population, but also proved a challenge in proving cases of intentional poisoning. As forensic testing expanded and public health became a routine topic, people started to scrutinize their surroundings and did not like what they found. Oddly enough, one of the deadliest things in most people's homes was the color green. Yes, the color green. A color that most associate with verdant fields and awakening of new life in springtime was actually an agent of death. Green was a greatly popular and greatly poisonous color and wreaked devastation on numerous families in the 1800s. At first, many felt they only had one shade, Snail's green to fear. Snail's green, also known as arsenic of copper, was invented in 1775 by the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Snail. The most popular formula seems to have been 42.37% copper oxide, 52.83% arsenic trioxide, and 4.80% water. According to Snail's notes, even the water used to make the shade could contain some arsenic, and noting that the water should not be disposed near cattle, hence to the toxic nature of the product. Although a pair of green candles seemed like a cute and fashionable decoration, every time they were lit, they released arsenic into the air. Although a green dress seemed lovely and festive for the spring season, as wearers danced about, the arsenic in their green dye detached itself from their finery and poisoned the air around them. Even an action as simple as dust in the floor in a green-walled room could lead to nearly fatal episodes. A case from Boston in 1863 shows just how rapidly arsenic could destroy someone. A woman named Olivia, after mere days in her new house, started exhibiting anorexia, trembling, and burning sensations. Upon the simple action of dusting her room, which is covered in green wallpaper, she developed brown fur on her tongue and experienced violent vomiting, as well as a host of other concerning maladies. These symptoms were greatly aggravated every time she cleaned her room, with her attending physician finding no other solution than to remove the green wallpaper or move house entirely. In a stern warning to mothers to avoid green wallpaper, Dr. Pi Henry Chavez declared that there is frequently enough poison on the walls of a room to destroy a whole neighborhood. Although this statement seems to be an exaggeration, it is possible that it only takes 3 or 4 grains of arsenic to terminate grown women. So this statement was frightfully true. In 1861, there was a report of a child being poisoned by placing a concert ticket in his mouth. Upon examination, it was found that the concert ticket contained almost 1.5 grains of Scheele's green, a quantity significant to kill a child. In 1853, a black woman in Richmond named Sarah Hamilton killed 2 of her children through accidental poisoning. Previously, she had loaned a white neighbor, Margaret Hayes, a teapot. When she went to retrieve her teapot, Sarah found a white powder in it, which she thought was arrowroot, as she had purchased some previously. When asked to confirm this, Margaret actually tasted the powder and agreed it was the harmless plant. It was not. Sarah took her teapot home, placed water in it, which I don't understand why she didn't rinse it out. Let's continue. And served what she thought was arrowroot to her children. Let's continue. Leading to their deaths. Upon questioning, Margaret recalled having purchased poison for Vernon, and that by some accident it was thrown into the teapot. Unfortunately, such baffling ignorance was not uncommon. Apparently. Just a year later in Amherst County, Mr. William Lavender took out 4 members of his family by the careless use of poison. In an attempt to kill some troublesome dogs who had been poking about his property, Mr. Lavender put some strychnine in milk, leaving it for the dogs, and then leaving his home without informing anyone of the milk's deadly content. His family discovered the milk and consumed it, leading to death for some and illness for the rest. You know, now that I'm reading this again, it makes me wonder, did you really leave that for the dogs? Who would do that and not tell their family, hey, don't drink that milk? Ooh, let's go on. Well, poison everywhere and potential poisoners quite possibly in similar abundance. How was society to protect itself? Again, release people from bondage. That's how you would have protected yourself. Let's go on. In 1836, a scientist named Marsh developed a new test for arsenic that was celebrated by all. The test was deemed so important that the Society of Arts awarded Marsh its highest honor. Marsh's test was absolutely revolutionary and held the potential to deter poisoners. It was able to reveal even tiny amounts of poison, being able to detect 2 parts of arsenic per million in a solution in organic matter such as food or vomit. Not only was the test able to detect such minute amounts of poison, it also worked on old remains, even those being decades old. Although this test was very accurate, it was not easily administered. If the investigators performing the test was unskilled, they could produce less than reliable results. They could also end up killing themselves, as happened in 8 recorded cases, by inhaling the toxins released during the test. Inaccurate results obtained by unskilled scientists could have resulted in convictions of innocence and the freeing of guilty parties. Luckily, the Marsh test was not the only new resource investigators had at their disposal. The complicated intersection of poison in abundance and disgruntled slaves was on display in 1858. A family in Prince William County alleged that they had almost been poisoned by their slave Lucy. And what will soon become a common theme, Lucy had previously had angry outbursts and made it known that she did not want to be with them. Yet, her masters still continued to let her cook. On the surface, this appears to be an easy to solve case. However, the heightened awareness of just how much arsenic was laying about led to skepticism. The White family had, as everyone else did, previously purchased arsenic to kill rats. Because there was so much arsenic readily available within the home, the neighbors defended Lucy by arguing that the arsenic was accessible to anyone, so it was impossible to definitively blame Lucy. This led to a successful petition that earned Lucy a reduced sentence of transportation or possibly hard labor. In Richmond in 1861, the family of a Mr. Robert M. Allen suddenly took ill after eating supper. Due to the uniform nature of the illness and its proximity to a meal, suspicion immediately fell on a hired slave girl named Elsa, or in other instances, Eliza. But before she went to trial, Mayor Joseph Mayo stopped the case to give family physician Dr. Dean a chance to analyze the allegedly poisoned food. This analysis must have turned up nothing, as just a few days later, Elsa was very apologetically released from custody with a paper declaring her ever having been suspected of such a heinous crime to be a singular mistake all round. Were it not for the new scrutiny given to poison accusations and new tools to give definitive answers, this case could have ended tragically for Elsa. Another case in Richmond, this time in 1864, confirmed the power of forensics. And what was deemed the schoolgirl poisoning case, Amanda, a slave belonging to Samuel Overton and working for Miss Clark, was accused of the heinous crime of poisoning several little girls. Amanda acted as the Clark family cook. One morning, she voluntarily made a shortcake for Miss Clark's daughter, Betty, to take to school. Betty left some of the cake home for her sisters and took the rest with her to school to share with her friends. To Miss Clark's horror, her daughter started to violently vomit and experience bodily pains. Betty was brought home sick before Miss Clark could call for her. The children remained sick for the rest of the night despite doctors attending to them, as none of the usual remedies worked. The only antidote that seemed to have any success was one typically used to treat arsenic poisoning. Due to the severity of the reactions, despite the small quantity of cake eaten, doctors were sure that the dough had been charged with some poisonous drug. This apparent poisoning came as a complete shock to Miss Clark, as she never imagined any unpleasant feelings between her children and Amanda. always thought they were on the best of terms. Was this a telling case of a slave owner placing too much faith in people they were oppressing by allowing them access to their food? Perhaps not. Dr. J.P. Little was given, among other things, including papers of powders, a thimble-sized piece of the shortcake to examine. One of the papers contained sulfate of zinc, and upon testing it, Dr. Little discovered the cake also contained the sulfate. Typically, the zinc was used as a very powerful emetic, and in its powder form resembles soda, as a great many other poisons do, but the testing did not reveal any arsenic. Dr. Thomas Pollard, the doctor who gave Amanda the zinc sulfate, insisted it was not a poison. Amanda's lawyer argued that Amanda put the emetic in the shortcake by accident, mistaking it for harmless bread soda. Although this was a compelling argument, Amanda's case was sent to Hastings Court, as even though the sulfate was not poisonous, there was reason to doubt that its use was accidental. Although it will never be known if Amanda had dark intentions or made a simple mistake. The court ultimately sided with her, and she was acquitted. Despite these breakthroughs in medical knowledge and scientific expertise, doctors could not always help slaves facing accusations of poisoning. When, if a slave decided to violently rebel, how did she go about choosing her weapon? Fire was the weapon of choice because it was easy to make a fire, and slaves generally would have had difficulty in getting hold of guns or knives or poison. During the 19th century, poison cases declined and more visibly violent crimes such as arsenic and violent murders went up on the trial record. Slave owners of the 18th century were more vocal about their distrust of slaves. So there is a possibility that more slaves were accused and convicted of poisoning due more so to their owner's suspicion than any actual act. 19th century slave owners lived in ignorance of the animosity their slaves felt towards them. They might not have had a significant level of distrust in their slaves to question slow poison deaths that resemble natural causes. So this difference in mindset, with 18th century owners acknowledging slavery for the evil that it was, and the 19th century view that tried to present slavery as a positive good, could be essential in understanding the difference between the frequency of poison charges in court. In a work aptly titled Fatal Self-Deception, Genovese break down slaveholders' need to blind themselves to the truth of the institution and therefore blind themselves to the dangers inherent in it. Southern masters, at least a great many, needed to feel loved by their slaves. I believe it. Some of the clearest expressions came from Virginia. For the 19th century Virginia slave owner, slaves were no longer expected to simply give obedience. They were now, contrary to life realities, expected to give love. This shift in mentality is shocking in its foolishness. And I will end it with that one and upload part 2 as soon as I can. In the meantime, in between time, thank you for checking the video. I hope you enjoyed the content. Like, please. It helps out a lot. Share, please. Subscribe. I appreciate it, or we appreciate it. And I will see you in part 2. Be safe. Take care.